Wow, Rob, thanks so much. It's exciting to be here, and I'm sure this is a topic on a lot of people's minds, especially with AI sort of daily in the news and everything we're reading about. So
Oh my gosh,
excited to
it's
be
been all
here.
over the chat since earlier this morning. So we're going to get into it in a moment. But first, I want to just hear a bit more about you, and also, so what are you working on in general, and how did you become interested in AI? Because it sounds like you've been into this much more than it was just popping into the zeitgeist over the last 6 months.
Yeah, so first off, for those of you who can't see me, I am a cisgendered white woman with bright red hair. I'm wearing a black and white top. I identify as a queer woman, and I am currently in San Francisco, and I'm just excited to be here. It's a great question. I would say, honestly, it goes all the way back to my childhood, Rob. I grew up in northern Wisconsin, so the winters were really long, and it meant reading a lot of science fiction, watching a lot of movies like Star Trek and Back to the Future and others. So I always kind of had that passion for science and technology, and did my undergrad in UW-Madison, focused on that intersection of kind of genetics and biotechnology, using a lot of different machines and automation. And then I moved to Boston in the late 90s and was focusing on a program through Tufts Medical School where it was epidemiology, biostatistics, ethics, thinking about cognitive biases and behavior science. So it's really been kind of throughout my career. One fun anecdote I'd like to share is in the late 90s, I actually advocated in that program to learn how to code a website for the nonprofit I was working with, because we needed a website, but we didn't have money. So I wanted to see if I could do it myself. And we got sort of a basic site up. And then over the years, just, both working for a health tech company that did big data initiatives with hospitals around how to use the evidence base for practicing medicine, sort of that clinical decision support. And then in the work I do at Ogilvy, it's really been focused on collaborating with healthcare organizations. I think maybe some folks have heard of the work the National Cancer Institute has done around big data and bioinformatics and technology to empower researchers in different ways. So I was able to interact with a lot of folks there. But I have to say, when I moved to San Francisco in 2017, I feel like AI and tech was being discussed on every corner that you would, as I was walking and navigating, and just attended a lot of sessions, and through my own experiences with AI, from exploring Midjourney and then ChatGPT, really saw some significant examples of bias. And just as a queer woman and as just a woman and someone operating in the world, I wanted to know more about that. So I've
Yeah.
done a little deeper dive.
Well, let's hear about it, because, and I love that you also, got rooted in science fiction, because our very first speaker of the day was talking about Asimov. So it all comes back to, science fiction as being a catalyst for so many of us who are interested in these topics. But as you said, you've seen in your work on AI a lot of these inherent biases and biases here. We've had tons of folks asking today in the chat all about, I kind of want to get into AI, but I'm also hearing about these biases. So can you give us some examples of some of the biases that you have encountered?
Yeah, so I feel like, and this is from a number of years ago when Alexa first came out. My Alexa's probably going to go off here in a second. I noticed that Alexa preferred my partner's lower voice and would not listen to me or would respond to me in the same way. And I actually had to lower my voice when asking Alexa for prompts or to do things for her to hear me. And I know now enough about sort of the programming and the back end of that may have been a bias the programmers had, where when they were testing that model or that mechanism, they were probably using a lot of deeper voices, maybe male voices, for that piece. So that's just one from a number of years ago. I was like, what's going on here? I think in the early days of using Midjourney, which is a text to image tool, and I'm an artist as well, so I love that kind of intersection of AI and art. I was looking to create some images for a presentation I was doing, and wanted prompted to do a professor. I wanted some images of professors with students. And every single image I was getting back was a white professor with mostly white, mostly male students. And it took a while, and I ended up having to, we call it prompt engineering, right? I had to write the statement in such a way to say, I want a Black woman in her 30s, surrounded by students of this, and this. And I had to be really specific in terms of getting the kind of image I had in my head that I wanted to share. So just seeing kind of the implicit bias that was there. And then a more recent example, I was chatting with somebody at one of our Start Out entrepreneur events, and they're working on tools to help train autonomous vehicles on how to see humans. And he was talking about, in the early stages, the machines were missing, the vehicles were missing, people that had different mobility issues. They were missing children. They were missing, people that had different gait issues. So they actually had to train and think about sort of what the different representations of a person might be. And, we got into a conversation because now there's actually clothing and mask technology that people are wearing to so that the facial recognition doesn't see them or cameras don't see them. So we got into a really interesting conversation about how do we train autonomous vehicles to make sure that they would still see individuals, even if they're wearing those kind of shirts or other things designed by AI to kind of disrupt facial recognition tracking. So those are three quick ones.
Wow. Yeah, no, so one of the classic examples I had heard was, and maybe this has been corrected now, but with early days of ChatGPT, at least, if you were asked to generate a story about a doctor and a nurse, the doctor would be male and the nurse would be female. And that kind of inherent bias that, that is in there in terms of gender roles, in terms of professions.
Yeah, 100%. And I will say, I joined ChatGPT on like day 8, so in early December, and I've noticed a huge difference. You're right, when you wrote stories in the early days of that, it was very stereotypical in terms of professions and interactions and others, but they actually did take proactive action and trained with new data sets and did other auditing and querying, and it's much better now. Now, is it perfect? No, but I have actually even been surprised with the level of emotional intelligence that has been involved in a lot of the responses in that, with the caveat that there are still a lot of things that you wouldn't use ChatGPT for, a lot of challenges with sourcing and citation and sort of that transparency element. So I always talk with folks that it's important to know what the sort of best uses are of these technologies.
Yeah, that's where being the editor kind of comes in. It just because it brings it back to you doesn't mean it's right. You then, as the human being, do need to kind of look into that, which kind of leads me into my next question for you, which is, what is some of the behavior science that drives challenges behind AI bias?
Well, Rob, we could have a whole conversation in an afternoon just about that topic alone. Because AI tools are built by humans, they're going to reflect the cognitive and other biases that we have across our society. And, experts in behavior science and psychology have identified more than 200 different types of cognitive biases. There's a great cognitive bias codex if you want to go check it out, with links to the Wikipedia descriptions and others. When I'm thinking about AI, though, there are probably a set of about 10 or 15 that come to mind. I'm only going to focus on a couple because we're short time today. So the four I'd love to cover are availability bias, framing bias, groupthink, and sunk cost fallacy. So I know those are pretty big words, a little jargony, but I'll break it down. So availability bias is when our judgments are based on the ease with which examples come to mind. So let's say if we had a recent hurricane, flooding and preparation and all that's going to come to mind really quickly for us. When we're thinking about ChatGPT or other large natural language processes, they're using English data, right? Most of it's from the US and the Western world, because that was easy for the developers and others to have access to, but that certainly isn't representative of the rest of the world. And there are biases inherent in even, the sort of availability and selection of that data. So think about, when programmers are identifying what information and data they're going to use to train tools, they can be really influenced by what's available, what comes to mind easily. And that's why having diverse teams is so important, so you can mitigate that a little bit. With framing bias, that's all about how we influence the outcomes and interpretation. So that example I gave you of Midjourney earlier, where I had to specifically kind of write in exactly what I wanted, that's an example of, my bias and my ideas around framing being inserted in there. So, that's another thing where people can identify and think about the way they're using the tools. Groupthink is what probably most of you would assume, right? So we're going to, some groups will prioritize consensus. They will not take a look at some of the dissenting opinions. If you have the teams that are creating these tools and they're all, have the same lived experience, are from the same places, same education, same perspectives, you're not going to necessarily see the alternatives or the options that might exist. And my early example of Alexa liking lower voices in the beginning stages, that was probably because the way it was trained. I think there's some other great examples in that groupthink, even in other areas. So I did a quick PubMed search about a month or two ago, and there were over 200,000 articles on AI. When I looked at the number of articles, published articles on AI and bias, there were about 4,000 out of, 200,000. So that's what, 2%, talked about that as a topic. And then when I dug a little deeper, because I'm interested in the impact to the LGBTQ plus community, there were only 4 articles at that time, right? So that's a tiny, tiny percentage looking at LGBTQ plus AI bias, types of things. So there's a little bit of a, group think going on there. And then the last one I think a lot about is called sunk cost fallacy bias. So that is when we have the tendency to keep following through on something when we've already invested a lot of time and effort and money, whether those costs outweigh the benefits. So I see this a lot, right? People pushed out different AI solutions and tools. Now they're finding the challenges with different biases and things they have. And if they had thought about that at the beginning, it might have been more cost effective. But now, maybe in that push to get something out quickly, things were missed and they're not as willing to go back and have to change things, or they're doing it after the fact when it can cause harm in those early stages. So I'll stop there. That's
that was all. Yeah.
Rob.
No, this is all great. And yeah, as someone who's working on programming this summit, I can definitely agree with you. The lack of articles sometimes on bias in AI in terms of the total things that are out there. And love to kind of talk too about how to unravel this. One thing you've already mentioned, which of course is at the core of our mission here at Power to Fly, which is if a workforce is more diverse, if you're hiring more underrepresented professionals, that's a great way, number one way, maybe to start chipping away at this bias. But are there other ways that that companies or even individuals can do to really start to unravel that bias in AI?
Yeah, I mean, you hit the main one, right? That would always come to mind for me. The more diverse our workforces are, the less likely you are to fall into some of those biases we just discussed. And even honestly, when we're thinking about using different tools, I might say, ask that question, how were things trained? What biases were considered? How diverse were the teams that put that together? And the companies doing it well will shout that from the rooftops, right? They will talk about, the thought they've put into it. So I think there's a couple of others, ethical AI design. So thinking about, we can start to unravel bias if we're being thoughtful about how to approach, the transparency, the accountability, the fairness elements, and that's also an area from an ethical standpoint, thinking about even the environmental and social impact of AI, how and where are jobs and roles being disrupted? What are the upskilling opportunities? And should companies now be thinking of that and including that as part of their business plans, for their workforces? And does that help us start to unravel and start to train up and get the sort of experience that people might need? I mentioned earlier auditing and testing. So, we start to unravel bias when we actually shine a light on it, right? So when we're looking and seeing what the impact is across things, when we're identifying the tools, and what those issues are, and thinking about, well, what is the approach to rectify that? Collaboration and continuous improvement are sort of the last two I would probably mention, right? So even the best company doing the best, AI analysis and auditing and being really thoughtful about how they're putting together their tool. We know from experience that as machine learning and other systems are getting more data and more input and more human interaction, there are still opportunities for things to change and to be impacted. I think some of you might have heard, in the news, what was it, a number of years ago, that chatbot that was unleashed on Twitter called Tay. In 18 hours or less, it was sexist, racist, bias, all of those things. So, that kind of idea that we're continually looking, at ways to reduce bias, we're identifying what things are happening, and we're collaborating with experts in AI, ethics, diversity, equity, inclusion as a part of these systems. So I think it's not going to be easy, but there are a lot of people working on this topic and who are very passionate about it. And I forgot to mention this earlier, but if any of you haven't yet seen the Netflix documentary, Coded Bias, definitely check it out. And the Algorithmic Justice League is doing some fantastic things to sort of be really proactive about unraveling bias in different ways.
Yeah, that's great. And then, well, kind of on that note, we had a question from the audience asking about emerging technologies or methodologies on the horizon that could be game changers in fighting against AI bias. So you touched on some of the things already, but are there specific kind of technologies or those methodologies that people are really exploring there?
So those who are like, I'm doing this program through MIT right now that's about leveraging AI for business strategy. And a huge portion of that program is focused on how to design and develop better solutions from the very beginning, and to be asking these questions early in the process, and to be thinking about who your target audiences are and about the interactions, and also about connecting the right technology to the right sort of tool that you're using. So at least in terms of, there isn't just one process or methodology for doing that. It is really specific to the industry, specific to the organization, and even specific to the type of AI technology. So focusing on bias and elements in robotics is different than, the chat GPT, different than machine learning, different than, some of the other tools that we have. So there isn't just one solution. I'm sorry.
Yeah. No, I think
that's a non-answer answer, but
no, we get all of this lumped into one giant. We can kind of be tricked sometimes by the media and what we read to go, oh, it's AI, and that's like one thing, that's all these things. But I think, as I've heard throughout the day here and all my other studies, no, it's all these different things. And in fact, machine learning has been around for years, and so there's all these different things that are kind of
right. So
exactly.
we've been talking about this a long time, and I think that people are encountering it more in their day-to-day lives than they might even realize. And that's one of the challenges I see too, is we're getting to the point where the tools we have are so sophisticated, it is getting more and more difficult for people to recognize when they are using an AI system. And I think that is a challenge we need to discuss, but we can totally later too.
Totally. Yeah, that's a great one too. Yeah. And we've talked a lot about the more negative side, but I'd love to touch on kind of the positive side, which is, how do you see AI being used for the social good? And more specifically, are there ways that AI can help combat bias? I'm thinking just, we use Slack here at, we live on Slack here at Power to Fly, and there's those great integrations that can say, should you say folks instead of guys? If you're using the word like crazy or an insane, it will suggest other words there. So are there other examples that you're seeing that AI can actually be used to combat bias there?
Yeah, I actually think that is great examples there. I think the ability for AI to reduce bias in decision making is huge, and we're only at the sort of early stages of that, right? So, there is the opportunity for, whether it's in financial models, and getting loans, whether it's in HR, HR tools and resources, hiring and sourcing candidates, whether it's in, the interactions we have. There are a lot of opportunities for for integrating AI to promote the fairness, minimize discrimination, those types of elements. I also think of its application from a social good standpoint for accessibility, right? So there are a lot of people with different needs. And there's some great examples where AI can be leveraged to help improve or speed communication, whether it's through, providing things in different languages, real time, whether it's speech recognition. There are opportunities around mobility and access. There was a news show here a couple of weeks ago with all over San Francisco. We have the Cruise autonomous vehicles sort of jutting around all over the place. And they interviewed a gentleman who was talking about, who was in a wheelchair and was talking about how many Uber drivers or Lyft or others are challenged sometimes with getting, the equipment into the car or other things, or they're not willing to sort of go through that hassle. But the autonomous vehicles are set up to allow for this person to travel, back and forth to where they need. So that's just one example of a mobility opportunity. I also have, you can let me know which rabbit hole you want to go down, Rob. I think there's lots, I'm an AI enthusiast, right? So I hope that's coming across, but, there are a lot of things we need to just be thoughtful and conscious of as we're deploying and thinking about these new technologies. So lots of applications in healthcare. I'm particularly passionate about the applications to environmental protection and disaster response. Smart cities, you let me know. I know we're tight on time.
No. I mean, and because someone was asking in the chat, and we certainly don't. There's way too many examples to get into in the 6 minutes we have. But they're just saying, what are some of the other negative outcomes of unchecked bias? I mean, we've touched on a bunch. I mean, I think there's too many to name, really. Certainly, as might apply to a lot of folks watching here that might be actively looking for a job. There can be that can help folks find a job, but it could also hinder. Are there other things that come to mind in terms of unchecked bias?
Well, I think in terms of, so this group is, I know, focused a lot on the jobs and hiring, right? So I think that it's sort of two sides of the same coin when we look at bias in the HR area, right? So there is the opportunity that if you don't program the AI tools right, maybe they're kicking out candidates that should be viable and would be great, for what's happening. And just because they don't have particular keywords in their resume, or because they have, I know a lot of those AI systems will kick out resumes with misspellings or with grammar errors. So, and a lot of those things are known. I'm not an expert in that area, but you can definitely find resources online that'll basically take you through a checklist, right? So make sure you're using the terms that that are in the job description. Make sure that you're getting somebody to review and proof it so that it's perfect, making sure that you might not include things like a photograph, or you might use more gender neutral language to be able to, get through some of the challenges. But I feel like the HR tools are becoming more sophisticated and are thinking about that, and are also, a lot of it gets back down to how humans do things as well. So for a lot of the bias, it's on our side. It's not the AI side, because if we deploy an HR tool, but it's not in a space where our target audience is going to see it or be able to even apply or even have that information, that's on us. That's not on the AI. So yeah, those are some of the things I think about. Oh gosh. Yeah, where do you want to go next?
No, well, let me ask you this. Someone is asking, are there tools that can help organizers leverage to ensure that their AI systems are fair and unbiased? Are there certain things that people can kind of connect to their AI right now?
So part of it is the people who are producing the AI really getting into how did they approach that? What are the considerations they have? Is there, an element where they can go in and do the sort of auditing and testing and things that you might be looking for? What are their privacy and consent and sort of other transparency policies that they have? So a lot of that you can do just by, when you're looking at the different tools that are options, you can kind of weigh the pros and cons that way. I would give preference to a company that is actually really transparent about the steps they're taking to reduce bias, to improve accessibility, to, audit and track and share and measure and sort of, also have updates, right? So as things grow and change, I would want a tool that is going to be updated and audited along the way as well, because that means that they're being really thoughtful and they're integrating that kind of removal or addressing of bias throughout time. It's not just a one and done. It's something they're doing with continuous improvement.
And we're almost out of time, but I wanted to ask you about this because I was not super familiar with this. And so I know probably it's much more detail than we have time for, but can you tell us a bit more about your thoughts around the Consumer Bill of Rights specifically related to AI?
Yeah, so Consumer Bill of Rights, I think a lot of us are familiar with that, whether, it's sort of flying, whether it's products and things of that sort. And the same tenets apply to AI. So thinking about, topics like transparency, consent, privacy, fairness, safety of these tools. And there's probably 20 more to consider there, but we're at an inflection point where we still have an opportunity to help shape the way that tools are created, the way that they're used, the impact they have on our society, the ways that we integrate them into our lives. And creating and having a shared Consumer Bill of Rights, I think would be really powerful. And, even just in the art world, we've had a lot of discussions around, when my images and other art are being used to help inform data, what is the consent I give or don't give? And then what is maybe the compensation model for something like that, when that's my livelihood? So that's just one little example exploring those consumer bills.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I mean, of course, the WGA just wrapped up their strike, and so much of these questions were there. Mm-hmm. You've seen, saw Sarah Silverman was suing ChatGPT, and for some of these very questions you're asking about compensation and consumer rights, really. So, I mean, as we've been saying all throughout today, this is really the Wild West, the beginning here of so many of these questions, and evolution was been a word too that we've used a lot today. And I think so much is going to be evolving as these products evolve at such a rapid pace.
It's very true. And I think that, AI has the potential to not just increase efficiency and effectiveness, but to really usher in a new era of creativity and innovation. Mm-hmm. And I think that can be a huge benefit for us, but we need to work together to be persistent around making that vision a reality, right? Like now is the time to be asking the tough questions, becoming aware of the uses and limitations and challenges and potential harms of AI, as well as all of the benefits that I think we can realize.
Oh, well, thank you, Skye. I know we just touched on the surface of these topics, but as I said, this has been something that has been really in the conversation all throughout today. So thank you for diving deeper into it. We'll definitely have to have you back because, as I said, we only touched the surface. So thank you so much for all of your insights today.
Thanks so much, Rob. And if folks have other thoughts or questions, you can hit me up on LinkedIn and we'll go from there.
Amazing. Thank you, Skye. Have a great rest of your day.
You too.